Okay, everybody, welcome back. It's time for the next section. We're going to start building everything. So this is where the fun begins now. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting up the actual game to work in landscape mode on a mobile device. We're going to be adding a terrain and assigning the grass texture. I'll then show you how to use some of the tools for the terrain, and then we're going to position it ready at 000 on the AR camera on the scene, and get everything ready before we start building on top of that with the AxeWorks models. So without further ado, let's get going. First thing I want to do is click on the Game tab. Now the Game tab, for those who don't know, is what you will see on your mobile device. This is kind of like the screen of the mobile. Now by default, you have a bunch of different settings in portrait and landscape. Now, if you don't see all these, or you want to add a new one, you need to come down to the bottom and click this plus sign, which is what I did to add the iPhone 6 landscape model in. So if you click that, and then you can type in whatever phone you want, iPhone 5, iPhone 6, or whatever you want, then we're going to give it a fixed width and height. And an iPhone 6 is a nice foundation phone to actually go for. Some of the newer phones have got bigger, more high resolution screens, but some of the older phones will be able to kind of upscale up to this size quite easily. And it's important because when we choose a fixed width and height to work to in a landscape orientation, which is what we're going to be using, then that means that when we start adding things like a button on the screen to click to fire the gun, and where we want to position the score and how many lives you have on what's called the graphic user interface, which kind of overlays on top of the camera, then we need to set anchor points to fix these into the corners so that when the screen resizes, everything actually will scale in proportion. The buttons will shrink or increase in size and correspond to the different screen resolutions. So go to the Game tab. If you don't have an iPhone 6 in landscape, click the plus symbol, come down to where it says width and height, and the width is 1334 and the height is 750. Obviously it's a reverse if you want to add an additional one for portrait mode. And then when you're done, just click OK. Now I've already got that. So there we go. I'm just going to click it. Now sometimes it's zoomed in a little bit, and that's this scale bar here. So make sure your scale bar is right across to the left hand side. Also, there's a maximize on play button. Just make sure that maximize on play is unchecked, as throughout the early infancy of this development process, it's easier if we play inside the editor without going full screen so that we can still see the hierarchy and view the inspector. Okay, so let's come back to the scene, and here we are. What I want you to do is right click and create an empty game object. Now all this is an empty axis. It's a vector basically, which has a position in the world, and I'm just going to click the cog and reset that back to 0 in the world, so it's directly in the center of the image target above the camera, below the camera, sorry, so that when the game begins, then we're looking smack in the center of the game, and we can orientate all the models and everything so that we get a nice perspective based on where you actually want to be sat to play the game, or stood, depending on what you want to do with it. Now, this game object here is going to hold all the landscape for the environment. So I just want you to click on it and change its name to say landscape. The next thing what we're going to do is we're going to add a terrain to this game object so that we have a ground to actually place models on top of. Okay, so we're going to add a terrain. Now up on game object, into 3D object, and then down to terrain. Here we go. And what that's done is it's spawned a giant landscape, which is flat, for us to play with. Now the first thing I'm going to do is make sure the terrain's selected and put it inside the landscape. And then what I want you to do, while it's selected, in the inspector panel now, we can see the properties of the terrain. And this cog here is where the settings are. And one of those settings is the size of this thing, which is massive. So we need to shrink this down a little bit. So make sure the cog is selected and scroll down the page. And let's change the width and the height to be 100. There we go. And that's something much more manageable to work with. Now the next thing I'm going to do is click here and select the move tool, and I'm just going to move the terrain so that the center is kind of central on the image target. We're going to scale the image target up as well, by the way, just to make this about right. So the image target now, I'm just going to scale that up. There we go. So it's in proportion. So for example, if this were a piece of A4 paper, when you took the photo, then the terrain would be the size in relation to this this image target. Maybe even make it a little bit bigger. I don't want it to be too huge. And then I'm just going to position the terrain again. What I'm trying to do is get the center of the terrain and the center of the image target. So that's about right for now. Now, once that's done and I'm happy with it, I'm now going to nest the landscape inside the image target. So I'm clicking and dragging and releasing on top. And there we go. So now the image target has the landscape inside, and inside the landscape we have the terrain. So now we get to have a little bit of a play. I'm just going to click the Y axis and just drag it up slightly so that it's slightly above the image target. I find it easier to actually work with that way. Now we have a bunch of tools over here on the right hand side in the inspector while the terrain's selected. If you roll over each one, it tells you what they do. This button raises and lowers the terrain. This button is to set a fixed height. This one is to smooth out the terrain. So for example, if we accidentally make a cliff, then you could click this button and it would blend the cliff down to make it more like a slope. This button here is how we paint on top of this terrain. So if you wanted to draw paths and things like that, that's that button. This button is if we want to place any trees, but they have to be specific model trees that the terrain can actually understand. And this one is for the similar thing, but for stones and plants. And this one is for a similar thing. It's just for placing plants and stones and other things like that. But once again, they have to be 3D models. Now it's very easy to make this look more like a terrain, like a landscape in no time at all. What we need to do is click on the paintbrush, and we're going to apply a base texture. At the minute it's just white. Now if you click edit textures, and you can add a texture, and this will be the base texture that will be used for the entire landscape. And what we're going to use is the graphic that we just imported for the grass. So here, what I want you to do, where it says texture 2D, is click select, and here is the grass. So just double click and watch what happens when I click add. There we go. Suddenly we have a grass texture. Now you can, if you want to, you can mess around with the scaling of the textures and alter the settings. Now we also have a bunch of brushes here. Now these different brushes will give us different effects. Effectively, what I want to do is kind of create a boundary around the outskirts of this map, really, of this terrain. And what we're going to do is, if going to settings, I'm going to fix the height to be about 200. We don't want it to be 600. It'll be too high. It will be, I mean, if you looked at it like this, the mountains would be this high up. So what I want to do next is click on the button here to raise the actual landscape. Now I'm going to do it dramatically at first, just to show you what happens. If I choose one of the brushes, The two options that we have is the size and the opacity. And basically this is the, well, I'll show you instead. Let's make the brush bigger, which obviously makes it bigger. And now if I click and hold the mouse down and move it around, you can see how we can sculpt a landscape. And if I keep my finger on it, then we get these crazy looking mountains like that. I'm just going to undo, and I'll show you what happens with the opacity. If I just click a few times, or click and hold slightly, then I make these smaller little bumpy mountains. If I increase that opacity, then it becomes much more rigid. Can you see? And I only have to leave my mouse on for a second, and suddenly we've got these towering hills. So I'll just undo that for a second. There we go. Now it works the same with different brushes. If I want to use this brush, for example, then we could have a spiky landscape. So something more medieval looking or fantasy world like. And if I bring the opacity back down again, then now I can paint around and it doesn't have an over-the-top dramatic effect. We still get the jagged hillside, as that's the brush that was selected. But if I were to choose, for example, this brush, then I can also raise the ground around it and increase the area however I want. Now it takes a little bit of practice to work with this, and obviously I'm just doing this a little bit over the top and being more dramatic for now, just to show you guys the effects. But what I'm actually wanting to do is choose one of the brushes that have kind of a furry blurred edge, bring the opacity right down and the brush size, well, it can stay quite high. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of create a mini border by just clicking and dragging and making like a bumpy surface around the outskirts. Don't want it to be too spiky, and the reason for that is not down to cosmetics, it's down to the processing power of the mobile phone. If we're working with a terrain and we have lots of jagged edges or even very, very rounded edges, then you will increase something called the polygon count. And effectively, that's the number of triangles that will be used by the mobile phone. Then the harder it will be to actually process this on a mobile device. So just give it the odd little bump through the middle. Maybe increase this slightly. I think I've got the opacity down just a little bit too low. Here we go. Let's put some kind of mount. There we go. Just lagging a little bit as I've got quite a lot going on my system. There we go. So nothing too major. There we go. That's not bad. I just want to create some kind of environmental world that will look cool on top of the table in front of us in an AR experience. And maybe I'll switch the brush and give these a little bit of an edge, just to give it a little bit of detail. Like so. Okay, cool. Now every time I do this, it's completely different. I'm doing it randomly. So yours will look nothing like mine, no doubt. If you make a mistake, you can also hold down Shift to lower. So if I want to flatten this, if I just zoom in, I can hold Shift and I can flatten that back out again, look. So if you do something a little bit too high, you can hold Shift and click and it will do the exact reverse. Now if you don't want them to be as spiky as they are here, you can click the Smooth tool and then we can smooth that out as well. And that will effectively kind of lower down the mountains and blend the area together a little bit. Okay, cool. So we have some kind of terrain, a little bit over the top. I've been playing around a bit too much now. I'll just flatten this out one more time and then just blend it in again with a smaller brush. There we go. So it's not as dramatic and it won't hinder the performance of the mobile. Okay, so that's enough for the terrain for now. So now we have a cool looking terrain. If I go to the game mode, we can see the side-on view, and that's because the AR camera is positioned right down here. So if I want to just move that up slightly, just to kind of see how that would look on the game. There we go. Now look, you can see how it would come together in the AR world. Cool. Okay, so have fun. Don't go too crazy with the terrain, as like I said, it's the one thing that can hinder the performance slightly. When you're finished and you're kind of happy with what you've got, just save the scene, and I'll see you in the next video.